Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Today is Tuesday, April 7th. This is our 17th conversation. Good morning, Penny.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing okay, although I think maybe we could talk just for a minute about something we touched on before we started recording, and that is this idea that we've been getting a lot of feedback from a lot of teachers who say that this has been a very good thing for them. This has been a little respite in your day. But if you watch the news, you're seeing that we're heading into the hardest days, that there's a lot of people who are going to be suffering. And so I just had this little niggling, concern that, posting these every day might be interpreted as sort of callous or uncaring, or disrespectful. And I know you and I kind of kicked that around this morning.
Well, it's the last thing either of us want, is for anyone to think that we're just going on as if nothing's happening. I think about, we've talked a bit. I get up earlier than you because I'm 3 hours ahead of you. And it takes me a while to get to a place where I feel like I can record these. I've been struggling more than usual. I think it's because I've been away from my son and my granddaughter for 5 weeks now, which is the longest I think ever. And I know for my granddaughter ever. And I just feel this like weight of all of it worldwide and all of the people that we're going to lose, and have a few people I know now that have it. And I don't want anyone to think that we aren't probably struggling as much as a lot of people are. And
so in the Twitter feed or in the on Flipgrid, and we welcome some thinking on this. We're leaning now towards continuing, because we've been told by a lot of people that they are longing for human connection, and they're longing for a little slice of normalcy in a world that's not very normal. And by all indications, it's going to get darker before it gets light again. And so I just wanted to throw that out there and let everybody know watching this that we really have heavy hearts about the whole thing. And unless you guys tell us otherwise, well, I think at this point we will soldier on. So
yeah, I think that I've been encouraged by all the people who are responding. I mean, I was something about us talking about what are we going to talk about and keeping our head in teaching just for this little bit of every day. That's been good for me. So,
right. So yesterday we had a great conversation with Chad. I hope everybody checked that out. But we thought to kind of counter the sort of dark intro to today's talk, that we would go back to talking about poetry. It's National Poetry Month, and a couple of days ago we Penny modeled her lyric mashup poetry, and I know that you received a lot of people. We've seen a lot of people online who kind of went home and did it. That was kind of cool.
Yeah, I think it's so restful to sit there. I was working on 3 Counting Crows songs, I think I told you, and just playing with those lines. And the funny thing is that you find a line and then all of a sudden it's going in a direction because you found words that would go to it. And then wrapping that around I left them in a pile on my desk. I hadn't glued them in, and I wrote an entirely different combination and glued that one down. So it's just fun.
It's fun, and fun is needed to walk into poetry, right? Because sometimes kids have a negative connotation when it comes to poetry. So we want to warm them up, have some fun as they walk into the unit. But today I think we're going to shift a little bit, and we're going to talk about how, at least in the first lap of our poetry unit, we get kids to analyze and recognize the craft of poetry. So I think, Penny, you have some slides that we're going to use here.
Okay, so when we talk about poetry, and I just want to pull these up for a second here, one of the things that we have learned to do in our classes, I learned from my colleague Joe Fernald. This is Joe. And I was observing him teaching once, and I walked in, he was teaching American literature, and he had a March Madness poetry bracket across the back wall, and the kids were debating which poem from the Harlem Renaissance should move forward. And it was the most engaged I'd ever seen kids talk about poetry. So I always say, with big thanks to Joe, that I started using it in my classroom. And I always started with 2 essential questions. What can poems do? and how do poets craft language to move readers. And if you look at this, the 16 poems that are up there were all chosen by students. This is a second round of the poetry bracket in my class. The first round, I usually choose the poems, but they had submitted all of these for consideration. And then we have our first round, which is you just choose a winner from each group of 2 poems on the outside, just like in the March Madness. And then you take those 2 winners and they become taking one winner round 1 against another winner round 1, and you get the semifinals, and there's only 4 of them now. And when we get down to the finals, and this takes several days, like usually we do a couple poems a day. When we're down to the finals, my kids are debating, they're talking, you've got to love my poem. I want you to know why the crickets have arthritis is the most important poem I've ever read. And there's, every time I've done this, just so much engagement. Don't you think so when you do it?
Turns into a battle. We've each had kids say, I cannot work with this table anymore. They do not see the beauty of this poem,
Oh yeah.
So I think, I love the idea. We both used it for a few years in our classroom. It's kind of artificial in a way. I mean, in the sense that you're comparing one piece of art versus another, but it is such a rich way to get kids to really zoom in on what can poems do and what are the craft moves that are made.
Yeah, I think it moves them beyond, I just like it, to
Right.
what is the poet doing, right?
Because you have
What's
to
the
defend
craft?
your answer. You have to defend your answer.
Yeah.
And my kids, I don't allow, I don't know what you do it, but I don't allow individual votes. I have them table vote. And a lot of times there's 4 kids at a table. And so it's a 2-2 vote. They have to talk it out and figure it out somehow.
Yeah. And I only do that once in a while because mine get really kind of angry when I make them have to vote with other people, or their vote is not counted because the 3 people at their table wanted something
Well, I
else.
generally follow it up with an individual vote so everybody has a voice, but I
Yeah.
initially start with them doing sort of table level wrestling.
I love that. And we've done that at conferences where teachers are just like, "Ah, why don't you love mine?" So sometimes I have the kids create their own brackets based on some poems that they love. And then they, at their tables, go through these. And if it's only 4 poems, they can look at these and come to some understanding and some talk. But one thing that I love about the bracket is, as India says here, she realizes that the internal voice that we adopt as we read, or the voice of the poet if it's spoken word, have a huge impact on what they understand about the poem. And it kind of goes back to what we had talked about with the criteria for judging it, because there are technical moves. And we talked a lot about Nancy's lexicon, which is on my website. But as India is saying, there's this affective piece that comes about sometimes more strongly just because of the sound of the poem and the performance of the poem.
Or a word or a metaphor or something that pierces you, right? And
Yeah.
so what I like to say to my kids is, if 2 is happening to you, the affective element is happening to you, it's because of some sort of technical move that the writer, the poet in this case, made. And so 1 is related to 2, and usually in some way, shape, or form. But how do you measure beauty of a poem, right? I mean, how do
Right.
you measure that's the one? And a lot of times kids will pick poems, that connect with something that's in their prior knowledge and background, right? That everybody brings their own, background and prior knowledge to the poem. And so a lot of times kids connect on that level too, kind of a cultural heritage kind of connection to it.
Yeah, I think that's why I love having my kids nominate poems for the second round. Because what happens when you start, you give them all of this poetry, especially spoken word, they're out finding poems that I would never hear from or even know of otherwise.
Yeah.
So what we thought we would try with you guys is to have you do a bracket, a short bracket, because it's 2 spoken word poems we call stage poems, and then you're going to choose 2 page poems for tomorrow, right?
I will bring 2 page poems tomorrow. So page poems are literally poems that are written on the written page, but stage poems is the term we use for, live performance or on stage performance.
Yeah, so I'm going to link on the Padlet the two poems, When Love Arrives by Sarah Kay and Phil Kay. And if you've never seen Origin Story, the two of them talk about the fact that they actually were at the same summer camps and kind of knew each other, but they're not related. They're not boyfriend and girlfriend. But I do want to say that I have both of their collections, and When Love Arrives is not in either of these collections. But I think it's funny. I have more than one of these Sarah Kay's in my little bookcase here. And inside I wrote to my class, please return to Penny Kittle, one of my favorite poets and favorite collections of poetry. I will rebuy it if you take it and don't return it. But there will be weeks between when the words here might have helped me and instead they'll be in your hands. Never underestimate the power of words in just the right order to help and to heal. Now, in order for me to have written all of that on the inside cover of a book means it must have been stolen so many times that I finally was like, please stop it. And it's always there now.
And I would say that I took a busload of students last year down into Newport Beach, where Phil and Sarah performed together, and it was a magical evening for many of my kids who love their poems. So if you have never used Phil Kay poems or Sarah Kay poems or the poems they do together in your classroom, highly recommend it.
Ditto. Date and Time is Phil Kay's collection. This is a terrific collection as well. And I love it when I pull something off the shelf and has all these stickies in it because they're poems that I want to share with kids. And I will have a link off of our Padlet so you can see. I'm just going to play a little bit of this.
I knew exactly what love looked like in 7th grade. Even though I hadn't met love yet, if love had wandered into my homeroom, I would have recognized him at first glance. Love wore a hemp necklace.
I would have recognized her at first glance. Love wore a tight French braid.
Love.
I'm just pausing it. I know you're going to love the poem, but I think there's such a difference between a two-voice poem that works like that, one says one way and then together, and a single voice poem. I think there's a difference in how they appeal to you or don't, because I've had kids say I don't like it when there's more than one on the stage. But When Love Arrives is up against A Lot Like You by Rudy Francisco, and he's performing in Washington, D.C. at a poetry slam for this. And I just want you to listen to the start of this one as well. I'm skipping his little introduction to the group.
Yeah. I was told the average girl begins to plan her wedding at the age of 7. I was told that she picks the colors and the cake first. By the age of 10, she knows the time and the location. By 17, she's already chosen a gown and a maid of honor. By 22,
I have to say, part of the reason I love that poem is I can remember telling my 8th grade girlfriends the names of my children. So it didn't strike me as that strange. His book is Helium, and A Lot Like You is not in this book, but oh my gosh, I have so many pages turned down in this book. I absolutely love this collection. So those are my two contenders. And we're going to ask you, I have the words, because I believe it's important that when I have a spoken word poem in class, every kid has a copy of the lyrics on their desk. So I have the words to both of the poems and Nancy Atwell's bracket, or her lexicon. And then we're going to ask you to compare the two poems, go on to Flipgrid to our little conversation, and register your vote. So does that mean the one that moves forward are only the people who vote on Flipgrid? Is that the way we decided to do this?
Of course, you gotta vote to have it move forward. So we're having a little miniature tournament over 2 days. These are the spoken poems. Maybe Penny, you could go back real quickly and show the two criteria again very, very quickly. So when you go to look at these poems, we're asking you to look at these two things. We're asking you to look at what's the technical elements. What did Phil and Sarah Kay do in those poems? Did Rudy Francisco do in his poem technically to create that effective response? And we invite you to do that little short bit of analysis of those two poems and then go on to Flipgrid today and post your response. Which poem do you think is better? And the most important part is just a little bit of justification. I picked this poem because, and I think that will generate some interesting discussion about poetry.
Right. So tomorrow when we come on, we'll tell which one won, because we'll add them up by tomorrow morning. And then you'll present your 2-page poems, and we'll do the same routine for that. We have a guest speaker on Thursday, but when we come back on Friday, we'll tell people the winner. And then, you know, the interesting thing is then if you're doing stage versus page, it brings up a lot of questions for the kids.
Sure.
Because how it's performed can have such an impact
Right.
on whether or not they love it or not.
I think the stage poems have a distinct advantage.
I do too. I think that, I mean, I think it's the poetry of the modern world.
Well, then that raises issues too. Like next time you do the bracket, should they all be stage, or should they all be page, or should you mix them up? That raises all kinds of issues there too.
Well, and like Joe did, his was on the Harlem Renaissance. And so just the idea of taking one period of time, and I had seen so many people take maybe 3 or 4 poems from the Harlem Renaissance and really study each poem. And I think that if you think about, there's times to zoom in and study one poem, and there's times to have a volume of poetry. And I think that the bracket allows you to give them lots of poems without that painstaking through each poem.
So, homework.
That's right. We gave them homework for once.
Go study the 2 poems, and then come on and vote on Flipgrid. Tell us which poem you think deserves to advance in the bracket.
Yeah, and I want to say one more thing about the brackets is we did one in 3rd grade when I was a literacy coach, and all kinds. We used Ralph Fletcher and all these people who've done wonderful kid poetry and even picture books, you know, transcribing the text, which is often poetry. And the kids absolutely got into it. They would have these little T-charts, and we called them Popcorn Fridays. So they'd have a cup of popcorn that they'd come pick up, and then they'd sit in there with their partner and they'd talk about which of the poems they thought should move on in the bracket. And it was just as effective with little kids as it was with our grown-up kids.
Great.
Yeah.
All righty. So enjoy the 2 poems. We'll talk more about them tomorrow.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, you guys. Hang in there. Stay safe.